Mexico City, 2007. You're a teller. Lines out the door. And then two guys walk in carrying cardboard boxes. Not suitcases. Not duffel bags. Boxes. Custom cut. Built to a specific measurement. Because someone, somewhere, measured your teller window and designed a box that slides under it perfectly. You don't ask what's inside. You already know. Everyone in this branch knows. It's cash. Millions of it. Small bills. Dirty. Smelling like a truck bed. It's the profits of the Sinaloa cartel, and this bank, your bank, is about to become the most important financial institution in the history of the Mexican drug trade. Not because they got caught laundering it. Because for years, almost nobody stopped them. HSBC calls itself the world's local bank. Cute slogan. Turns out it was more accurate than their marketing department ever intended. Here's the part almost nobody puts in the pitch deck. HSBC wasn't born clean. The bank's origins trace back to 1865, funded in part by profits from the opium trade flowing through colonial Hong Kong. A business built, quite literally, on moving a controlled substance across borders for people who weren't supposed to have it. A century and a half later, the company would find itself accused of doing something eerily similar. Same instinct, different drug, same continent it started on, funneled straight into the other side of the world. By 2002, HSBC had swallowed a struggling Mexican bank called Vital and rebranded every single one of its branches. Overnight, one weekend, thousands of signs, into HSBC red and white. Instant scale. Instant access to one of the largest cash economies on earth. But that was just the beginning. Because at the exact same moment HSBC was expanding across Mexico, the country was collapsing into a drug war. President Felipe Calderón deployed the military into the streets. Cartels were generating more physical cash than they could physically move. Piles of it, rooms full of it, safe houses stacked to the ceiling. And cash has a problem when you're a criminal organization. It's heavy, it's traceable, and until it's clean, it's basically just paper you're not allowed to spend. The cartels needed a laundromat the size of a country. HSBC Mexico became it. Here's where it gets interesting. According to U.S. federal investigators, this wasn't a few rogue tellers looking the other way. This was structural. Between 2007 and 2008 alone, HSBC Mexico moved roughly $7 billion in physical cash into the United States, more than any other Mexican bank, by a staggering margin. Investigators would later say the volume was so extreme that HSBC Mexico should have been treating every single shipment as a red flag. It didn't. Court records would later reveal something almost too on the nose to be real. Those cartel cash boxes weren't just conveniently sized. They were shaped specifically to fit through HSBC's teller windows. The bank had, functionally, become so trusted by traffickers that its own physical infrastructure was being reverse engineered around. And this is where you meet the second character in this story. Not a cartel boss. Not a banker. A young compliance analyst named Everett Stern. In 2010, Stern takes a job inside HSBC's anti-money laundering division, assigned to monitor transactions flowing through the Middle East. Within weeks, he notices something strange in the wire filters, the automated system built to flag payments to sanctioned countries and blacklisted names. Someone, somewhere inside the bank, appears to be deliberately breaking the formatting of those payments. Small edits. Symbols inserted into names and account numbers. Just enough noise to make the filter fail to match, and just enough precision to suggest whoever was doing it knew exactly how the filter worked. He reports it. His supervisors wave him off. He reports it again. Same response. This is where things get interesting, because Stern doesn't let it go. Frustrated by the silence inside the building, he starts reaching outside of it. First to the FBI, then to the CIA, feeding them what he's finding for over a year, while still showing up to his desk every morning. By the time he leaves HSBC in November 2011, the inquiry he helped ignite has widened far beyond wire filters. Investigators are now looking at HSBC's operations across the Middle East, Mexico, Iran, Sudan, and the trail keeps leading back to the same institution over and over. But that's just one thread. The regulators had already been pulling on this string for years, and every time, the bank promised to fix it. In 2003, New York regulators flagged HSBC for weak money laundering controls. In 2010, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency hit HSBC with a formal consent order, again demanding it fix its systems. That's not a warning. That's the second warning. Internal reviews would later show the bank had been cited on this same failure across 4 separate examination cycles, and every single time, the problems were acknowledged and then left to rot. They didn't know what was coming. Because HSBC's global affiliates, branches with ties to Iran, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, and Burma, were allegedly stripping identifying information off wire transfers before routing the money through HSBC's U.S. accounts, erasing the digital fingerprints so American compliance systems couldn't see who was really sending the money. Investigators would later estimate more than $600 million moved through the U.S. financial system this way, tied to nations under direct American sanction. 2 continents, 2 criminal economies, 1 bank sitting in the middle of both, allegedly profiting from the silence, and 1 compliance officer inside it, quietly building a paper trail nobody asked him to build. July 17, 2012, Washington, D.C. The U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations releases a 340-page report with a title that reads like a horror movie: U.S. Vulnerabilities to Money Laundering, Drugs, and Terrorist Financing. HSBC Case History. It documents everything. The boxes, the billions in unmonitored wire transfers, the stripped sanctions data, a trafficker's own recorded words, captured by Mexican law enforcement, describing HSBC Mexico as the preferred bank for moving drug money, the way you'd talk about a preferred coffee shop. Then, in front of the cameras, mid-hearing, HSBC's global head of compliance stands up and resigns. On the spot, before the punishment has even been decided. Half a world away from the hearing room, Everett Stern watches the story he spent over a year quietly feeding to federal investigators become national news. Within months, his role surfaces publicly, first through reporters, then through a Rolling Stone feature that brands the entire scandal with a phrase that will end up following the bank for over a decade. Gangster bankers, too big to jail. Because inside the Department of Justice, prosecutors are building something much bigger than a fine. Rank-and-file attorneys reportedly draft a list of up to 175 potential criminal charges against the bank. 175. Enough, on paper, to indict HSBC as a criminal enterprise. But that list never leaves the building. December 11, 2012. The Department of Justice announces its decision. Not an indictment. Not a criminal conviction. A deferred prosecution agreement. A legal arrangement where the charges are written up, signed, sealed, and suspended. Frozen. As long as HSBC behaves for 5 years, the case simply disappears. The number attached to the deal sounds enormous. $1.921 billion. The largest anti-money laundering penalty in history at the time. But break it down and the math turns uncomfortable fast. $1.256 billion of that wasn't even a punishment. It was a forfeiture, the government reclaiming money it considered tainted. The remaining penalties were split across the OCC, FinCEN, and the Federal Reserve, each taking their cut. Financial analysts covering the story that week called the total cost to HSBC's actual balance sheet trivial. One put it bluntly on the record: the fine barely dented the company's book value. For a bank that size, $1.9 billion wasn't a gut punch. It was overhead. And the part that mattered most wasn't the number at all. It was who didn't get charged. No HSBC executive faced criminal prosecution. Not one person went to prison. The bank's former Mexico chief executive quietly stepped down, described publicly as a retirement. At the press conference announcing the deal, the Justice Department's own Assistant Attorney General laid out the reasoning almost in plain sight. Pursuing a criminal indictment risked stripping HSBC of its U.S. banking license entirely, and a bank that size losing its license, officials argued, could ripple outward and destabilize the wider financial system. The system made one fatal calculation, and it wasn't about guilt. It was about size. The phrase that followed HSBC out of that courtroom wasn't justice. It was too big to jail. And for Everett Stern, the analyst who spent a year quietly building the case that got the bank here, watching the institution walk away with a fine instead of a felony conviction became the moment his story stopped being about compliance and started being about accountability itself. You'd think that's where the story ends. A scandal, a settlement, a headline, a slow fade into the archives. It isn't. HSBC wasn't even the biggest cash pipeline discovered that decade. A separate investigation into Wachovia Bank, later absorbed by Wells Fargo, found the bank had processed roughly $390 billion in transactions for Mexican currency exchange houses tied to cartel operations, with prosecutors flagging at least $110 million in specific drug-linked deposits. Wachovia paid a fraction of what HSBC did. No criminal charges there either. Two different banks, one recurring pattern. The bigger the institution, the softer the landing. Then, in 2020, a leak of confidential U.S. Treasury documents, the FinCEN files, revealed something the public wasn't supposed to see. HSBC allegedly kept moving suspicious money for years after its 2012 settlement, even while under the direct supervision of a court-appointed monitor. Shell companies, networks tied to alleged fraud schemes, hundreds of millions in flagged transactions, filed away in internal reports, and allowed to continue anyway. The monitor watching over HSBC was lifted in 2017. The bank was pronounced reformed. No one went back to check the boxes. But the story doesn't end in silence. In October 2024, more than a decade after HSBC's settlement, TD Bank pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering, becoming the first U.S. bank in history to admit criminal guilt for it, after failing to monitor $18.3 trillion in transaction activity and letting fentanyl trafficking networks move hundreds of millions through its branches, in one case with tellers allegedly bribed with gift cards. The Attorney General stood at the podium and said the quiet part out loud. By making itself convenient for criminals, the bank had become one. TD Bank paid roughly $3 billion. It pleaded guilty. It's now operating under an asset cap, legally barred from growing past a certain size, a first. And still, not one bank executive charged. 12 years, one guilty plea further than HSBC ever got, and the same sentence at the end of the story.